Welcome to ArtNow, the Columbia College Chicago Art and Art History Department's curricularized one-credit speaker series, where students learn about and engage with a diverse mix of art makers, curators, critics, historians, and entrepreneurs, international, national, and Chicago-based, who are actively authoring the culture of our times. Lecture participants are exposed to the rich range of perspectives, practices, and professional pathways possible for the contemporary creative. I'd like to thank Mimi Yu, who organizes, films, and edits our lectures, Sam Foster, our graduate teaching assistant, my colleagues Joan Giroux, Adam Brooks, and Amy Mooney, Gina Ordaz for her help with our guests and student visits, and our chair, Duncan McKenzie. And now I would like to share with you a selection of our visitors from the semester. Since COVID, ArtNow has been broadcast from a live Zoom to YouTube. These are available for 72 hours after they are live broadcast. On February 17th, we hosted our esteemed colleague, Amy Mooney, an art historian in the Art and Art History Department. On March 3rd, we hosted Paul Socarides, artist and director of Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. March 17th, we hosted Indigenous maker Natani Nota. And on April 14th, we hosted Sampada Aranque, an SAIC art historian. And of course, tonight, we are rescheduled from previously with Lilli Kayes, Interdisciplinary Arts alumna from Columbia College, Chicago. And now it is my wonderful honor to introduce Lilli Kayes. She is an artist, educator, and naturalist from St. Louis, Missouri. She earned her MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts and Media from Columbia College, Chicago. She currently teaches at Maryville University in St. Louis. Her work is a fusion of her love of the natural world and her passion for education. Ecological issues and histories of the natural world drive the focus of her work. Her passion stems from learning traditions from people with deep connections to water. She grew up swimming with cow-nose rays, diving for mollusks, setting crab traps, and fishing. Her goal is to create art that ignites curiosity of the natural world, promotes STEM education, and inspires environmental stewardship. And I can also say, having worked to organize this lecture, it is a truly beautifully visually stimulating lecture as well. So with that, I hand it over to our friend and colleague, Lilli Kayes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mel. It's such a wonderful introduction. I also really want to thank Mimi, Joan, Sam, and Gina for organizing all of this. This is such a wonderful lecture series and a great opportunity to share my work and passions with all of you. So as Mel said, I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I like to think of myself as a transdisciplinary artist and angler, and I really am looking at educating people about local ecology. I think generating curiosity of the natural world is a great way to foster relationships of understanding between humans and nature, and realigning our relationship with that. We tend to have very human-centric views as nature as a resource to be taken, and often overlook the fact that we are part of that and are dependent on that. So growing up, my family spent a lot of time in nature. My father and his family actually grew up in the Chesapeake Bay area, and they had to fish to supplement their food and income. So farming, fishing, beekeeping, everything that they could think of to actually be able to survive was quite important to them. And those traditions were passed down to me. So one of the biggest things that I'm involved in is a lot of fishing practices and living off the land. I'm really interested lately in foraging and skill sets that reach local food income sources for myself and for my family members. So tonight, I would like to share with you my recent solo exhibition, Gaia Theory, and talk a little bit about that work, and then also the evolution that's come out of that art practice. So to get started, what is Gaia Theory? So Gaia Theory It started out as a hypothesis in the 1970s. It was originally created by chemist James Locklev and microbiologist Lynn Margulis. The theory asserts that all life and all the material parts of the Earth's surface make up a single system, a kind of mega organism and a living planet. So in the 70s, when it first, came to the public view, it really was overlooked. It started to gain traction in the eco-activist community, and the public really responded to it. It's really sort of the first time we're looking at a metaphor to describe how Earth systems work as a whole. And these are inorganic and organic components. So that's looking at human waste and structure as part of the ecosystem. So as the public really enjoyed this, this view of the goddess of Gaia as our living Earth, the scientific community felt that it leaned too heavily into metaphor to describe such a complex system. So I chose to use this name for its metaphor. I thought it was a really wonderful way to see ourselves as part of nature and as part of that system, to really get to the point that we have an impact and we're a part of it. I like being able to view things on an aerial level and then start piecing apart little pieces of those stories. So the next thing we want to talk about is, what does this look like? So this exhibition is really designed to mimic the Natural History Museum. I grew up fascinated with the Natural History Museum model, this idea that you go there and you explore and you learn and you see sort of the objecthood of nature, how we've turned these creatures into objects that are brilliant and stunning and beautiful and interesting. This particular design for this exhibition is based on the Noise Museum in Berlin. It uses vitrines to create the sterile, cold look that we get from this. Everything's very spaced equally. Everything's, the shadows are aligned. Everything's sort of not like completely lined up and perfect as much as possible. The idea behind the vitrines was really to create this, elevate the fact that these specimens are elevated in value after ownership and after they're turned into objects. So we're creating this separation between us and nature through the glass of this vitrine. And it kind of is this sort of sadness of this object living its next life in a box, and we didn't appreciate it until now. So I really wanted each sculpture to be presented as evidence of decline and point to a system in decline. So each of these sculptures tells an individual story about a particular system, and together the individual works create a rhizomatic web of connections that tell a story about Missouri ecosystems and human interaction. So our first species is the mucket. So this is a freshwater mussel species. We actually have over 60 different species of freshwater mussels in Missouri, and this is one of the most prevalent species found. So these were actually heavily sourced to make buttons in the early 1900s. These animals live in shallow waters, buried beneath the mud and detritus. They're good indicators of water health. And these ones in particular, I found these basically in my backyard. They're not more than 20 minutes away from Maryville University. And these things are living among us. This specimen in particular is actually quite large. It's about 7 inches wide. In Missouri, you're actually able to collect these. This is something that you don't need a permit for. You can actually go out and collect these. I usually just have a fishing license just in case, but there are a lot of things that you can forage for in Missouri, and this is one of the weirdest ones I've seen. So this work is interactive. It brings attention to me for the impact one person has. I think one of the greatest things holding us back is our thought that our actions don't matter on an individual scale. Um, I feel like we tell this story to ourselves to keep access to convenience, but this work really forces you to be complicit. So on the surface, it's a work of joy and curiosity, but if you really think a little deeper, you realize how morbid this interaction really is. The movement of the audience drives this false resurrection of the animal through technology. It's meant to show that your presence holds power and responsibility, and regardless of whether you're aware of it or not, it's happening. Um, the way this functions is it's actually an Arduino that's hooked up to a motion sensor. So as you approach the object, it opens and closes and continuously does so until you leave it alone. So um, this was one of the stranger things that I was kind of playing with. It's an animatronic Muppet. So that was very fun to actually explore and think through. The next work is very similar. It's also an interactive piece, but this one's really looking at butterflies. We often overlook butterflies and their importance to the ecosystem. So this piece in particular is about destruction of pollinators and how that threatens our food systems. So butterflies are threatened by climate change, pesticides, monoculture, and loss of habitat. They play a really important role in balancing the ecosystem. They're a major pollinator in agriculture, along with bees, and they're an important food source for bats and birds and other small mammals. So these butterflies in particular, it functions the same way as the mucket. As you get close to it, the butterflies react. They start to come alive and move. And if you notice, the butterflies are all slightly different. They're different species that you can find in Missouri. I thought that's really important that we keep that local quality to each piece. So really kind of expanding on these smaller ideas into how they connect outward. One thing, that I wanted to make sure that with my materials that they're aligned with my message. So I chose cardboard packaging from products that may have been pollinated by butterflies to show the sort of range of products that we wouldn't have without our pollinators. So this piece is really coming down to implicating people and their importance in responsible consumerism and alignment with nature. A lot of our food production systems are quite hidden from our daily lives, and to think of that scale, your cereal, your coffee, everything that you enjoy has been pollinated. So it's a big deal. Our next piece is another mucket. I love these guys. I think they're absolutely fascinating. And this piece is really looking at water health. Like I said earlier, the muckets are really great indicators of water health. And this is because the mussel acts as a purifier. It helps increase the water chemistry and quality. So what they do is they filter feed by inhaling water through two openings. And one extracts oxygen and then it gets sent to the stomach. So food particles like algae, bacteria, phytoplankton, that is what this creature eats. So it basically is a water purifier. And these guys can get, they can get up to 7-8 inches. And some of them can live over 100 years. So the larger the species that you find, that's a really great indicator that the water is getting healthier, and also with the variety of mussels. If you find lots of different types of species in one area, that's also a very good indicator. So for this piece, I decided to use kind of color coding, this system of organization to look at water health. And what does that include? So the green is really representative of algae and phytoplankton, which are critical food resources for fish, turtles, invertebrates, anything that's living in the water. Those food sources are very critical. The dark blue is dissolved oxygen. So dissolved oxygen is just the amount of oxygen in the water, which is really important. for any life form that's living in it. The light blue indicates clean water. The brown indicates harmful bacteria. Yellow is chemicals, things like fertilizers, harmful compounds used in agriculture, ranching, anything that you spray on your yard, it eventually is going to end up in a water system. And that's why it's so critical to be much more responsible with how you choose products to use on your yards, if not use none of them at all. Because it will run off and it will eventually get into our river systems. So water health for me is everything. Our next specimen is the painted turtle. So the painted turtle, the shell, this is actually the shell of the painted turtle, and there's a 3D print imposed on top of into it to kind of complete the shell. So turtles are really fascinating. They have this one in particular has a high reproduction rate, and it has an amazing ability to survive in polluted wetlands, and that accounts for its range. So these things really take a beating from humanity, and they keep going and flourishing. So the turtle, I chose this because it's something that it has a long narrative tradition in many cultures. There's a lot of superimposing of the earth onto this creature in terms of storytelling. So it's a symbol of patience, determination, and wisdom. And I like to think of this as sort of a warning sculpture. We have this enduring struggle. This turtle is trying to hold the weight of the humanity, and the city of St. Louis is perched on its back, precariously slipping, and as it holds the weight of humanity, it begins to break, shift into something synthetic, and the 3D print begins to replace the bone. Nature begins to shift out of wilderness, and it becomes a tangle of synthetic and organic. So these tendrils that you're seeing coming down are actually sourced from a swamp in Missouri that I do a lot of specimen collection, and these in particular are the root systems that tether the leaves floating above the water to the earth. So this idea that this creature is untethered, floating, and trying to survive is really predominant in this story. That it's barely floating, it's trying to stay afloat, it's trying to hold humanity, but that weight is starting to shift and we're going to see collapse. One of my absolutely favorite things to talk about is Asian carp. Asian carp have been a love affair of mine for many, many years. I think they're absolutely fascinating and wonderful creatures. Asian carp is an umbrella term for 4 different species of carp. So, and these are invasive species. We have the grass carp, the black carp, the silver carp, and the bighead carp. And these guys were introduced in the 1970s. They were brought in to help reduce waste in retention ponds and agricultural facilities, and also fish farming. They were placed in a lot of different areas, but we had quite a bit of flooding, and that eventually let them escape into the Mississippi River, Missouri, Illinois. The entire Mississippi River basin is basically overrun with this. So it's no longer just a Midwest problem. They're getting into everything. And these species are highly competitive. They have high reproduction rates, and they outcompete local species for food. So that phytoplankton that we talked about, that was a critical resource. These guys eat their full weight in it multiple times a day. I mean, they're algae monsters. So the one thing that is really cool about them is they are midstream swimmers or midstream feeders. So what they do is they're not what people consider common carp. They are free floating in open water and actually pulling in resources and filtering it through and ingesting them. So the things of like heavy metal, mercury, the contaminants that we worry about with other carp species, we don't have that issue with Asian carp. Um, they have high amounts of macro and micronutrients such as protein, iron, potassium, calcium, omega-3 acids, and 9 essential amino acids. So these are superfoods that are floating around in excess, waiting to be used as a resource. So one thing, we have an image problem with this fish. Most people, and particularly Missouri peoples, they think of carp as trash fish. And this really comes from that common carp that it eats everything off the floor, it sucker fishes everything off the floor, and it accumulates all sorts of toxins and stuff, and they're really not good to eat. Their flesh is actually dark, so they're not the same thing, but people always think carp are these trash fish, and they're just wonderful. They're this untapped resource that I think is so critical to dealing with some of our sustainability issues, especially in the fishing industry. And then also it's a great local food source. I just went to a local fish market and got an entire carp. I believe it was $6.50. It was 99 cents a pound. And this is an amazing food. It's tasty. I mean, it's easy to cook. The only issue with it is it does have quite a bit of bones. But if you can kind of get past that, it's amazing. So in this exhibition, I really wanted to highlight this wonderful fish. And I did so by using sort of like throwback old school taxidermy methods to create these. So I went out and caught these and then cast them in plaster. And then for me, I always find it fascinating when taxidermists use actual, you have sort of the molds and then the parts of the animal. The fins are all cut off from the fish and included in these sculptures. So those are the real fins for these fish. So this sort of old style of cataloging nature and exploring nature, especially fish, I think is a really great way to point back to the sort of natural history design that I've created. I wanted to throw in a couple things that made you feel like you were in that space and you had that presence. So one of the ways I also achieved that was to create this small body of work, which was, I called it the museum collection. And this is looking at 3D printing and scanning techniques. They're so accessible that, museums are beginning to digitize their collections, and these prints that you see in front of you are actually open source from a lot of different museums across the globe. So I pulled files off of their website and just printed them up. So and these are high resolution. I mean, the resolution on these prints is unbelievable. The file sizes are just enormous, so you can get incredible detail. So I included the coral because we talked about water health a little bit ago, and runoff that gets into the rivers. Well, those rivers go somewhere else. They go into the ocean. And we get dead zones, we get fertilizers and cow feces, bacteria, all sorts of different things run down the river and end up damaging coral reefs and plant life, animal life. Anything at the mouth of that river is damaged. So I'm also looking at local issues, but I'm tethering it to that global outlook. That idea of Gaia theory, that we're talking about one corner of our plate where we live, but it affects everything else, So those two things I think fit really nicely together. I also wanted to kind of criticize museums and how they keep and curate objects. I mean, we can print them now. We need to start moving forward in more ethical ways in terms of our museum collection and to decolonize and return histories to the people. And we have 3D printing. There's other ways to get information and educate people without ownership and objecthood. So these pieces really serve as this sort of halting place and bridge between local and global. The last piece in this exhibition, I like to call this Tether. It's really a piece about biodiversity, whereas the rest of the exhibit is not very bright. It's pretty muted. There's not a lot of color. There's a lot of isolation. I wanted to put this as a juxtaposition to that to show the vibrancy and magic that I discuss in my statement. The magic of nature. That without us acting and trying to preserve these things, we're going to slowly lose everything. One species is dependent on another, local, global. We're all entangled and interconnected. And this piece is 10 feet by 14 feet. I projected it onto a large wall so that participants could walk up, their shadow could interact, and they can actually meditate and spend time with this and also watch it slowly wither away. Every 10 seconds a new video goes to black until the whole span of it eventually dims to black, and you start to lose that magic, and what you're left with is a gallery full of objects manipulated by technology, and the loss of that magic cannot be replaced. So I had a lot of ideas for this exhibition, a lot of work researching and trying to connect things. And, right now I'm at 5 months away from creating this work and showing it. And I've been doing a lot of reflection and resourcing and researching with, the space. With space from this completion, I can really see the work more clearly. And a lot of these things are things that I've been thinking about in my head for a very long time. I get flashes of images of these sculptures, and it really felt like an exorcism, like getting these feelings and thoughts out. And then I started to realize that they're sort of manifestations of depression and mental health issues, and struggling to face the scale of issues that we address, that we're up against in today's world. So I kind of kept thinking of it as a death knell, like this idea that like I'm putting all of these ideas out here, I'm trying to educate, but it doesn't go farther than that. I'm not addressing how to deal with these issues. I'm merely presenting them to the public to educate, and then what's the next step? So getting all of this out really allowed me to realize, I'm here now, I can do something. Okay, what is that something? I can do better for myself and those around me, and not just point at the issue, but actually begin to expand beyond that and work in community atmospheres to move forward. So Gaia theory doesn't address what we should do. It's sort of a warning. It's very much we need to wake up before we're putting value on objects in a room instead of being out in nature and enjoying the things that we have. So I want that transformation, and that comes with investigating alignment. Out of all of this, I really resonated with the idea of realignment. So I started doing research and reframing how I define impact. And for me, the next step forward is really looking at the cross section of functional design and art making practices that I already participate in. So the work brought up several questions for me. At the end, I kept thinking, well, what can I do? Obviously, beyond what I have already done. Can the individual have an impact? And what am I willing to do? I think we often get these grandiose ideas of action without considering what are you willing to put what's at stake? What are you willing to do? How far are you going to go? I constantly think about convenience as, you know, access to convenience as sort of the downfall. You know, we're so busy, we move so quickly in this modern world that convenience is king. I don't, you know, I don't know if several years ago I would have thought to research where my food comes from, understand every single aspect of my consumerism, but that's starting to be extremely important. Where you put your money is where it flourishes. So we need to start, you know, thinking locally in terms of our food. Um, we're not very far from systematic collapses, you know, and that's something that's very real. So I started making a list. And this is not a complete list. This is just sort of off the top of my head. Regenerative systems was one that I was very excited about. Things like beeswax wraps that can easily made. How do you preserve your food? How do you put it away in the refrigerator without all the plastic and all the nonsense? Um, Decreasing plastic, how we're using plastic, composting. I've recently started fishing for my food to supplement, you know, what I'm already eating. If I want a meat, I go out and get it instead of going to the store and making those quick compulsory decisions. So cutting out meat, that's one that I think is difficult for most people, but I think there are alternatives, and that would be local butchers, local farms. Getting into a community and a relationship with your food is a really great way to understand what's really at stake and also what's actually happening. Recycling and upcycling plastic and other materials in the studio. One that I'm really excited about is community supported agriculture. There's a really wonderful group called Known and Grown, STL. You can get on their Facebook page and find a lot of resources for where to get honey, where to get people grow mushrooms, people do composting. There's a ton of different types of farming and all sorts of things out here that people have put together. And also, like I said, local products, learning about the systems that are around you that are already in place. Community outreach, that's important. You know, get outside of your own community and the people that you've you know, familiarize yourself with. Go learn about new people, spend time with people, invest in community. You know, resilience, learning to make yourself accountable regardless. You know, no excuse accountability. Missouri Coalition for the Environment is also a good way to familiarize yourself with what's going on legally. Call your representatives, you know, get involved, understand what's actually going on in the world around you. It's really hard to slow down enough and make it happen, but start scheduling some time, you know. They don't have to be complicated. There's a lot of resources that make it easier to integrate it into daily life. So and then addressing the stories we tell ourselves to keep the convenience. You know, I'm very much interested lately in storytelling and perception. So the things that we use to justify our actions and moving beyond that, that those actions that just serve to scratch the guilt itch, you know, prioritizing listening and learning, learn from other people, you know, don't expect to have all the answers. And that's really where that community building comes in, and learning from others to work together. And then Claire Pentecost is a really great example of that with the public amateur. This practice of learning and showing what you're learning as you're learning it, and that way your audience and you are connected in that experience. So you're not presented as an authority figure, you're actually creating a relationship and working together. So all of this kind of encompasses these ideas that I'm trying to integrate an evolution in my art practice. So one way I'm evolving my art practice is through collaboration. To be perfectly honest, collaboration was something quite frightening to me. You know, I'm a little bit of a control freak, so Learning to trust people isn't exactly easy for me, but it has been one of the most rewarding experiences I have ever encountered. I recently worked for the last year and a half with some colleagues of mine from Maryville University, Dr. Carol Berger and Professor Scott Angus. And we worked on creating this documentary that really looks at the rural dental crisis in Missouri. So the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services sponsored us to do this. They commissioned us to create a tool to, one, express the concerns and then also some of the solutions. So basically, some of the issue is that we have a lot of people that have access to Medicaid, but they don't have access to dentists. Um, Dentists in Missouri that actually accept Medicaid are like a handful of doctors, a handful of dentists, I mean. Um, if you want to see a dentist, you have to go to Kansas City, you have to go to St. Louis, or you have to go to Columbia. And that takes hour-long drives, hours to get the help you so desperately need. And people don't have the money or the resources or the time to get access to these things. So, you know, there is a huge gap in terms of access to people that desperately need help. We really focused on children in this issue because we would go through and interview these children, and their teeth were black and they were in pain, and just to get information to get help is a chore. I recently had an issue with my teeth. I didn't have dental insurance, and I went about trying to figure things out for myself, and it was difficult. And I live in St. Louis, so to make Medicaid easier, the process to add benefits for dentists to actually use Medicaid is so important. So this documentary is really trying to advocate for dentists and hygienists to start creating some change within that, whether that be teledentistry, early preventative care in your primary care physicians, your pediatricians. It's so critical. One of the things people might ask is, well, why does this have to do with environmental stuff? It does. So we also have this issue with clean water in Missouri. So if the fluorinated water that you need to drink to take care of your teeth is not palatable, or you cannot drink it, you're not getting fluoride. So your dental health is actually declining. And people are turning to drinks with sugar or bottled water, which does not have fluoride in it. So this is a public health crisis. This is an environmental issue, and it affects so many people in Missouri. We have a huge gap. So this collaboration, to be able to speak with people on a real level and understand, and not just through a screen researching, but getting on the ground and spending time with people, it's transformative. So, I enjoyed the process because it challenged me to push farther and do more than simply make pretty objects. So collaboration has been pretty key for me. The next collaboration I'm actually working on this summer ties into my favorite fish, the big head carp. So I'm actually collaborating with a professor at the University of Missouri to create artwork in an effort to fundraise for his research project, Eat Mo Carp. So it's Eat M-O Carp. It's a research project that's looking at using the Asian carp to harvest and process as food source that can address two important issues, which are how to deal with invasive species, but also how to tackle malnutrition. So this project is working to find a way to preserve the carp in order to utilize it as a superfood resource. So it's about 90% protein. It's very clean. It has an abundant amount of nutrients in it. And for this particular project, they're looking at using it to address undernourishment in Haiti. The application for this research can be applied for local food insecurity as well, and disaster relief and beyond. But protein is such a difficult thing to get in these areas. So, this is a local resource. It's cost effective, it's plentiful. It would be almost impossible to completely eradicate these species out of our river sources and our ponds and our streams. So it's such an important resource that we can use. So getting people to understand the value of this thing that we live next to is critical. So collaboration. This is sort of, I've been experimenting with fish printing recently, and fish printing and 3D printing as viable options for fundraising. These are more abstract pieces. I was really looking at how heavily inking something would create abstraction or pull detail. There are different methods of pulling finer detail, which is something that I have done in the past, but I kind of am interested in looking at it a little bit more abstractly. So these are some good examples of that. So I mentioned functional design as a potential for moving forward in my art practice. I'm also looking at open source DIY projects that speak to alignment. So this sort of offering up what can you do? What can the individual do? What's some of the answers? You know, I'm looking at generating projects that kind of look at gardening and sculpture. This is an example of sculpture and gardening. It's a little overgrown because we haven't cut it back yet, but if you can look closely, you're going to see a circular structure. This is actually a sculpture that I created in 2012, I believe. And I basically took it down, stripped it down, put it in my parents' backyard, and I use it to grow cucumbers. So this sort of orb shape, it allows the cucumbers you create a higher yield because they grow up and around. And then it also protects any plants on the inside from deer and other anything that's going to get in there. So I like the idea of sculpture as a way to utilize vertical space to increase yields, and especially in places where you don't have access to property land, things that you can do in an apartment or a small area. Those are critical. I don't think it's just about here's stuff, you know, here are things people can do when they have some land. No, it's everybody. Let's make this accessible. And that includes composting experiments, upcycling projects, paper making. Right now I'm experimenting with fish emulsion fertilizer sculptures. So you creating fertilizer sculptures that you actually plant in your garden to increase your yield and propel plant health, so that you can actually, you know, grow your own food and use that as a food income. So right now, collaborating and experimentation are critical to my practice. So I'm really playing with, I'm trying really hard to think of ways that I can evolve my art practice that works well with alignment. So for me, it's really about relearning what hope means as an action word, that well-wishing and those sorts of things are not viable. And I want to continue to take steps in an effective direction moving forward. So thank you so much for joining me tonight and letting me geek out about the things that I just am so in love with. So thank you so much.
Lilli, we're so grateful and we're so proud of you. Thanks for this really intriguing conversation. You know, one of the things, there's so many points of entry, because we had also a really interesting conversation before we started too. I just want to point out that the students really responded to your work. So we have a lot of really robust questions to think about as well. But I just want to point to first that your work is truly interdisciplinary. I would say in my experience working with students, about 75% of them actually mistake interdisciplinarity for mixed media, right? So I would love to start out with your experience. One of the students said your work was just so intriguing, and as a fellow Columbia student, you're now alum. How did the interdisciplinary program shape the way that you make work in a truly interdisciplinary fashion?
So I think it really, I've always been somebody that's looked at making art sort of in the format of the scientific method. You have an hypothesis of how something would work, and I really view things as an experiment. The way that Columbia, and my experience at Columbia College integrated that was this idea that the experimentation comes with the materials. The materials and the concept always come first. So um, it's not about a medium in particular, it's about the message that that medium holds, and that's how it takes shape. There are inherent histories and stories that each object holds, and how can we place those objects and those materials together in such a way that we're creating a story. You know, we're telling a story about a natural system, or we're telling a story about human nature, and how do we weave those together and use those to juxtapose and respond and play off of each other. So the interdisciplinary is really coming in, learning as many skills as possible. I remember I took paper making. I experimented with making algae paper, and that was just unbelievably wonderful. And 3D printing and coding, and what do those materials have? What do they have to say? What are their histories, and how do I play with that? So it's really not about pushing myself in one little category. It's expanding outward and really looking at concept as the most important thing, and how to communicate that.
Well, and that's a really nice segue into your work in STEM. I mean, one of the things that's so particular about this body of work is that you hope it is educative, right? That it has function as art object. I mean, the students also really responded to the beauty of the work as art objects, and we can talk about that as well. But one of the students pointed out in particular that your work is at this intersection of the art world and the STEM world. And they had a really interesting question. STEM and art are both historically male dominated fields, right? I mean, one of the biggest conversations we have now in STEM is how do we get more women to the table, right? But somehow you found a way to navigate both simultaneously. In what ways do you think that being a woman has been advantageous to your work? What advice do you have for young female artists who are beginning to navigate the art world?
Uh, I mean, me being a woman, it makes me want to do it even more. You know, like we need this representation. It. I don't really. I don't know. I've always used being female as sort of a balance between. You know, I'm fishing. I mean, I go bow hunting. I stand on the back of a boat, standing up and shooting fish with a bow. Any activity that is claimed to be male dominant is my territory. I will jump right into it because I think it's complete bull. You know, these sort of engendered activities is absolutely ridiculous. So I enjoy. You know, during um, my thesis exhibition, I wore this ridiculous pink frilly dress and started, you know, cutting up this huge fish in front of people and playing with that. I really do flaunt that in certain aspects performatively. You know, I will feminize myself a little bit more just so that I can make a point. I typically, I don't wear jewelry or do very much in my personal life, but there are times when I definitely will use that just to push it forward, to push it a little bit more. Because I think that performative aspect of gender in terms of my artwork is important, that this is not about what you look like. This is accessible to everybody. So with the STEM education, it's really showing people that if I can make something that's this idea of beauty, the standard idea of beauty, and push it a little bit farther, manipulate it with technology, and add that element of coding into it. What is that? I think that's where that space, that question of what is this, and why does it need to be about being a female? It should be that this is cool, this is beautiful, this is interesting, this is dynamic. So I really am interested in creating works that integrate coding to show people like you can do this. You know, there are people out here doing this, and you know, this is just a made up cultural thing that we've all subscribed to.
Well, and your thesis was memorable. That was a really interesting, you know, it intersected a lot of ideas, but cutting up fish in the thesis exhibition. Boy, we had some fun times with those thesis exhibitions. And in COVID days, boy, it just reminds me how just fascinating and enjoyable all that interactivity was in person. There's a lot of conversation about your 3D printing. I mean, I think we're starting now to get into these conversations about technology and the intersection of your work with technology. So one of the students quoted you, "We created technology and can never go back, so it must be harnessed in innovative and sustainable ways to take the pressure of humanity off our planet." And so the conversation was around 3D printing and kind of how you reconcile that material. So I'll just add to this that before we started, we had this conversation about clay, and you mentioned, I think it's a really great follow-up to this question. You mentioned that there's a certain need to get away from a plastic focused 3D modeling. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the expanse of 3D modeling. I mean, you certainly educated me on some things, and go back to this idea about how we can harness these technologies to be innovative and sustainable.
Yeah, so first, the comment on technology, it's the idea that, Pandora is out of the box. And unless we see a widespread decline where technology is no longer usable, it's always going to be a part of our conversation. And even after a collapse of that nature, you're still going to have the remnants of it. So the idea that we need to harness it in sustainable ways, we have effectively a lot of the technologies we need to support ourselves more sustainably. The issue is getting people on board for that, and positions of money making that make that very difficult to do. So we can innovate what we already have and push it in new directions. So we did talk about a little bit with the 3D printing, the need to get away from plastic. We use PLA plastic. So for my 3D prints, if they're plastic based, they're PLA. So it's a biodegradable substance made out of corn, which it's still bad. If it takes 100 years, 200 years for something to break down, how do we call that sustainable? It's not, I don't like those imperfect solutions to it. We stamp a label on it and call it sustainable or biodegradable, but 200 years, I mean, no, something should biodegrade within my lifetime for it to be sustainable. So the idea of the clay, I've been looking into doing 3D printing with clay. So actually sourcing Missouri red clay locally, and you basically water it down, get a very nice fluid material, and through a peristaltic pump, what it does is it squeezes liquid through the tube, and that's how you program it to do what you would do with plastics, and you can print clay and other materials. They do it there's construction. So there's 3D printing, and then there's fused deposition modeling. So fused deposition modeling is really what we're talking about, to get away from what we think of as 3D printing plastics. So the fused deposition modeling is literally it's an additive, adding layers and fusing them together. So you can do that with concrete, build homes. You can do that. They've been doing it in biotechnologies to start trying to grow organs, to grow meats that vegan meats that people can eat without killing animals. There's so many different applications to 3D printing that goes beyond what is the poster child, the PLA plastic. And that's what I mean about using technology in more sustainable and innovative ways, because we have the tools, we just kind of not using them in the right direction. So we can steer it in other ways, and put the funding in that. Yeah.
I mean, the idea too that the corn is not, I mean, it looks good on paper as a sustainable practice, but one thing, Maggie Puckett, who also graduated from the program, and I were working on a project with dumb tar paper, which a lot of the art publications are published on dumb tar paper. And to your point, what we realized ultimately when we tried to figure out the source of the paper and sort of the history and behind how the paper was produced was that sustainability is a reference point to a pre-existing industry, which is to say that it's sustainable comparative to the absolute epic failure that was industrial papermaking at the turn of the century. It wasn't sustainable in the way that the consumer economy is trying to sell us an idea of quick solutions to complex problems, right? So that was a mind blow and really made me think more carefully about what the whole concept of sustainability is. And I think of that being adjacent to some things that you said earlier about convenience and about choices that we're making, obviously. And this is so clear in the whole trajectory of your work. Can you talk a little bit about your material sourcing? You mentioned in your talk that you're trying to upcycle plastics, but how do you circumvent this question of convenience when you're trying to get work done? I mean, obviously you're working for a living, you're trying to get as much time in on a practice as possible. So what are some of the ways that you're dealing with that in your practice?
Well, I'm a hoarder. That helps. I have tons and tons and tons of boxes labeled with materials that I've saved for the past 10 years. I would say organization is key to keeping track of everything. It's not like I make a book with everything in it, but for instance, the thesis show that we had for my grouping, I took half of the stuff that they had, all the stuff in their studios. I packed it up and took it with me. Justin Botts's, all that copper mesh, it's in a box down here. I have it in a box. So it's the upcycling part of it is actually really not that difficult because I keep track of everything. I've got wood. Also, I source stuff from my friends. My dad's in construction, so I get access to a lot of things, materials in St. Louis that really easily, metals, wood, all sorts of things. So it's really about collection of objects and repurposing them. And then the other thing that I do is I reuse materials in my exhibitions. So for instance, if you noticed, all of the wires and stuff that I use, these wires come apart really easily. So what happens is I can reuse this. I don't have to solder. I use breadboards. I take all the parts away. I take it apart and reuse it for something else. So every piece of work gets recycled into something else. Now, if somebody wants to buy the work, yeah, I'll solder it and make it more archival, like we were talking about earlier. But in terms of materials, everything gets reprocessed. So, I mean, I've used this fish in an exhibition before. All I did was use dowel rods that I found in the basement of Columbia College, painted them. And, I've got probably like a whole box of spray cans, spray paint that I found. A lot of it's found objects that are just being reused and taken care of, so value in this little piece of string, this piece of wire is valuable. It doesn't get thrown away. If I have to throw things away, they go properly recycled, and I put it in a box. If I have a recycle box, stuff that's broken that I can't use goes in the recycle box. And then when it's convenient for me, I will sort through it and take it somewhere to be processed. But it's about creating systems in your own life to make things easier so that convenience itch doesn't get you and you like, oh, I threw this plastic away, I got to go get it, so I just keep a box and I put everything in the box and then I go through it at a later time, and try to do that maybe once a month, and that makes it a lot easier to go. These materials also are sourced locally, so I go to local electronic stores and support local businesses instead of popping on Amazon, which is super tempting at 3 a.m. when you're trying to get something done. But I can drive and go get this, it's not saying
do you have a studio, or is your studio in your house or apartment, or what's your workspace like?
I sort of
call yourself a hoarder, so
I borrow other people's spaces and garages to put stuff. When I do have right now I'm kind of in a nomadic living situation. So everybody's house is my studio, their backyards, their garages. I kind of pop in with my friends and do, can I print something over here? Can I do, so I keep it in boxes and keep it organized. It's a lot of stuff. I would say every time I move, most of my studio is the majority of things that I'm moving. So um, yeah, I have a studio space. I actually, you, my grandparents had a pool table that they weren't using, and I turned that into a studio workspace and built in some organizational pockets. I don't know. I reuse everything in weird ways just to make it functional. So
I love it. Pool table as studio. It's nice. As somebody doing my art practice, I'm looking at my loom in the bedroom, and my dining table turns into my studio space after 8 p.m. I think that's actually a very great thing to be sharing with the students. Also, this idea that your collaboration extends into working in other people's spaces. What a great idea.
yeah, and I also do quite a bit of furniture design. That's always been something that's helpful for me. So um, I was living in a smaller apartment and didn't have any studio space. So what I did was I built my own a huge studio table that can telescope up and down. So if I'm working on something, I can pull it up, use the whole space and stand. But I can also drop it down to make seating for if I have friends or family over. And then also, like, if I'm doing coffee table and want to hang out and put my feet up. So I try to make my spaces very accessible and multi-purpose so that, I can have that space without
Where
sacrificing.
did you learn furniture design?
I have a lot of random skills.
Did you study it at school?
No, my dad's was a project manager and did a lot of restoration work for historic buildings downtown in St. Louis. So
No.
I work on cars. I build furniture. I do lots of random things.
Fascinating, fascinating. It's a little bit of a divergence, but it's an important point that the students brought up about your use of aesthetics, your use of beautiful things and seductive, gorgeous objects. And that a lot of activist work, as one student pointed out, uses violent and or jarring imagery. And to the students, it seemed to them that your work was kind of the opposite of that, that the beauty of these creatures and these objects allured us into a conversation. Could you talk a little bit about the use of beauty and representation of the natural world as a strategy in your work?
Yeah, so really that sort of beauty and seduction with the objecthood is it really comes from being in natural history museums, this sort of perfecting the object and craftsmanship. I come from a studio art background, so I have a BFA in studio art. So craftsmanship, process, aesthetics, those are all things that are very, I was trained very deeply into that. I have a concentration in painting, believe it or not. So it's this weird thing where, you know, I, I want it's the idea of the curiosity. I mentioned earlier that that's always a goal, is the curiosity, and I think that we can put up images of turtles with straws in their nose and use that powerful image. But we can do the same thing with an object that's not this horrifying thing. That the idea that the turtle and the straw in the nose, that, I mean, it incites a movement, but it kind of incited the wrong movement. Like plastic straws, or not using them is not gonna do very much. It's sort of like, look over here, distract you, while there's all this other stuff that really needs to be addressed. And so while I appreciate the sort of violent imagery, and I think that that's very powerful, um, we need to educate people about this stuff. So that means we need to get people in. We need to get people to look at it, appreciate it, see the beauty. And that's how I feel about it. I have done work that is a little bit more jarring in terms of that, but it's an honoring nature. My work is honoring nature, and I want people to love it. I want people to share that joy. I don't think that the threatening imagery is necessary to end goal. If I can get somebody to be like, that's a weird moving mucket thing, how'd you do that? I'm in. I don't even have to, I don't have to convince people. I can show them weird stuff that's pretty and start a conversation. So weird combinations, curiosities, that's really where I want to live, because it creates joy for me and for others.
Great. So, to sort of wrap us up, I'd love to hear what you think are some trends, in some conversation trends. You talked about some of your collaborations going forward, but what kinds of conversations are you seeing in, for instance, water management, and where do you think your next bodies of work might go?
So some of the conversations I'm having, particularly with the Asian carp one project, is it's really a matter of consumerism that drives a lot of the issues with getting this fish to be used as a resource. It's not that I don't have to make people believe that this fish is good for you. It's the fact that one, we have a history of talking about carp in a negative way, and two, investors don't want to put money into it. The infrastructure, I mean, they have a whole team of people in marketing, resource management. There's a whole team of people working on this project, and it's just there's no market for it. It really comes down to this sort of consumerism and pushing of money that's holding things back, and that's what bugs me. It's how do we get them to invest in communities? How do we get them to invest in people that need help? Because it's not profitable, and that's where a lot of these blockage with any of the issues environmentally are coming from. It's about money. It's not lucrative to take care of the environment. It's not lucrative to change our systems and align more with nature because we're not making money. And that food systems, water, agriculture, any of those things, it's about money. And marketing valuable, is it valuable to market? Can we can we do something with this? So that's really the conversations I'm seeing, or at least what I'm taking away as more, not necessarily new information, but you start to understand the depth of it.
Well, it's the challenge too. So when you look at a project like Mo Carp, right? Based on what you described, that's like feels like an almost insurmountable odds on that, right? But then through the artistic process, you're trying to shape a discussion differently around it, and maybe participate in some of in a different, I mean, what kind of plans are there for that project in the next few years?
So it's really, I'm kind of coming in as a very outsider influence in that. My thing is really working with them to help them fundraise. They do have a viable foothold. What's really cool is in community building, this project has started with local businesses as well. So you have commercial fishermen teaming up with restaurants and grocers to actually sell this stuff. So if you can
Interesting.
micro markets and expand outward from there, that's really, if you get a foothold, you can keep going forward. So it is viable. It's just a matter of, for me, I want to reframe it, aesthetize it a little bit more, make it a little bit more interesting than weird t-shirt with a fish on it. Let's have a conversation. Let's do something cool. So the project's going to really take on, I'm going to be working with him to create some work that people can buy, and that money will go straight to fundraising for this project. And then do some fish filleting and discussion about the fish, because I'm familiar with how these fish need to be filleted. So getting people to understand what this actually looks like, the white meat, instead of the ideas and stories that we're told. So it's going to take on more of a community interaction role between me as an artist and supporting this project. So
it's fascinating the way you describe the micro market expanding out. So basically, again, we're going back to these viabilities that are more localized, and you talk a lot about that too. I mean, again, we're all so tricked into these, Amazon level ideas about how things are supposed to be distributed. But earlier, I didn't quite understand that project really does already have viable outcome just on a more micro level. It's fascinating, totally fascinating. Any plans for like residencies or, dream travel for research or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm really interested in residencies. I've been looking at a few, especially ones that merge arts and sciences, where you can work with scientists and work with research projects. I like the idea of playing a supportive role, and sort of reframing research in a way that is more accessible. And that rolls right into my educational desires, to I just love teaching people about this stuff, because I'm very passionate about it. It's my favorite thing to do. I mean, I can talk about fish for hours. So yeah, I would love to travel. There's a lot of bio and art programs and things in Amsterdam and areas such around there. A lot of weird stuff going on down there, and I would love to dip into that. Even have spaces to really play with, um, I don't know, farming residencies, things of that nature.
Oh yeah, it sounds perfect for you. We have actually a great tie-up question in the chat. Any advice for Columbia students who want to participate, merge their practice with environmental issues that may feel overwhelmed by the options? I guess at the root of that question is really like, where do you seek out your relationships and your collaborations? I think that's often very mysterious to students when they look at projects like that. How do they start? I mean, you obviously seem like somebody who's already, I'm kind of fascinated with this idea of just showing up in people's yards variously and doing things, but how do you start these conversations to get these collaborations going?
So, I think this would be helpful for students. I have a fear of email. It is anything that I fear that's email
Oh,
based,
for
that
sure.
means I have to do it. So, contacting people, I'm that person that puts my finger on the button and goes and takes a deep breath and then pushes the button. So, I mean, it's not magic. It's not, there are people out there with high functioning levels of anxiety, such as myself, that you can do this. Just reach out to people, especially as a student. You have power. Oh my goodness, do you have power? All you got to say is, I am a student at Columbia College Chicago, and I am researching blah blah blah. And I was wondering if you could, give me some notes on this or that, or I really enjoyed your research project XYZ. I had some follow-up questions. Would you like to meet with me? You just need one in. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be asking a question, it could be having them look at something. You don't have to have it all planned out. You just need one in, whether that's commenting on their work, talking about how it's inspired you. It doesn't matter. As a student, you have power to do this. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just find one in and then have a conversation. When you have that conversation, then you can cultivate that relationship and you start having a real relationship. It's not just an email, whatever. With Zoom, you can meet with anybody in the world. Just email them. That's, I know it's scary. Write an email, have one of your professors check it. I'm a paranoid person. I have my friends look at my stuff and go, yeah, that sounds good. Calm down and hit the button. If you need your friend to push the button, do that. It doesn't matter. You just need one in. And that's how I do it is, for instance, this carp project, I went hiking with one of my colleagues, Scott Angus. We go hiking and I pick up booklets from different places and find different information of like these really niche things. And I happened to pick up a book at Bass Pro Shop, read this article and was like, oh man, this is exactly what I've been ranting about for 10 years. And I just emailed him and I said, I'm really interested in your work and finding a way to support fundraising efforts for you. And then the very next week I met with him, and that started the relationship.
I appreciate the idea of the person-to-person contact, though, because I think, not to get too professional practice here, but, texting and email tend to be a very easy way to get edited out. It sounds like you use a lot of human touch to the conversations you have with people in order to begin a relationship, which is very interesting. I also love the idea too that it can be quite not random, but based on, you know, your interests and just pursuing them. And sometimes you get really lucky and people will respond. And it's fascinating. Thank you so much, Lilli. This was a really great conversation, and I can't wait to see what's next for you. Thank you for sharing your work with us tonight.
Thank you so much. This was a really wonderful experience, and I felt very strong conversation, and I'm a little pumped right now. So
Good. It's a good
thank you.
way to end. Good way to end. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be starting again in the fall. This is the end of our series for spring 2021, but we look forward to seeing you again in the fall with a new lineup.